Ann Rimler. I am president of the Boynton Beach Historical Society. We welcome you to tonight's events. We have tonight's program, Wachee, City of the Mermaids, care of Florida Humanities. And Nora will be putting a link in chat if she hasn't already. Tonight's program will be recorded as well, so it's going to be on our YouTube channel. The link is for you to take a survey following tonight's program, Wachee with Lou Vickers, and we ask that you please take a moment and complete that survey. The response is very important and will help Florida Humanities understand that we appreciate their programming and speakers like Lou Vickers. But first, I want to welcome Barbara Reedy, our program chair and first vice president. Barbara?
Yes, thank you, Anne, very much. Our speaker tonight, Lou Vickers, has an extensive list of authored books and has been awarded a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship for fiction. Wachee in Seminole is Little Spring or Winding River. And tonight, through the generosity of the state's Florida Humanities Speakers Bureau, we're going to take a trip down memory lane as we visit one of Florida's earliest tourist attractions. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Lou Vickers.
Thank you. Okay, now let's see if I can share my screen here. Get the slideshow going. Can y'all see that?
Looks good.
I gotta do it big. Okay, that's I like to start with this slide. Can y'all hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, I like to start with this slide because this was the very first time I went to Wachee. I grew up in North Florida, and my parents had, 4 kids and not a lot of money, so we kind of stayed in the northern part of the state, doing our trips to Panama City and staying in the little motels over there. But at some point, I saw a sign for Wachee, a billboard, and it had the big mermaid on it, and it just really captured my attention. And so that image of this mermaid stayed in my head. And when I grew up and became a writer, I decided I wanted to write about it. Now, as a kid, I would play being a Wachee mermaid because I grew up on Lake Seminole in Chattahoochee. That's where the mental institution is. And I grew up over there, so I had a lot of imagination, probably growing up in a little town like that, So when I grew up and became a writer, I wrote several stories that had a mermaid character or a reference to Wachee in it. And then I decided I wanted to write a novel about a Wachee mermaid. And I'll explain some of that later, how I came to that, because it has a connection to the spring that's up here, which is Wakulla. But anyway, I started working on the novel, and I'm like, I haven't been to Wachee. I have to go. There's no way I can write a novel without going there. So I went there. And the day that I went to Wachee, the older mermaids were performing, and they called themselves the Tales of Yesteryear. And they were performing, and I met Mary, who's on the left, and her brother Ed, who obviously is on the right. And I just was charmed by them. And so I decided to write an article about these mermaids, these older mermaids that were performing. And so I ended up doing that, and I put my novel aside, and later on it just kind of snowballed into a book project. So I started with a little essay, and then it snowballed into the book project that I ended up writing the whole history about Wachee. But Mary and Ed were the first 2 people I met, and they took me under their wing and took me into Ed's Winnebago and introduced me to a lot of mermaids. And that's how it all got started. And that's my son, who's now 25. So that gives you an idea how long ago. He was probably 3 years old in that picture. So this has been a while. Mary's still going. She's 92 years old. Ed passed away, but Mary's still kicking. This is a picture of Ed. from one of the mermaid reunions. He was quite a character, and this is him at one of the reunions. He's wearing the tail and he's on one of the props. And that gives you an idea what kind of personality he had. It was a lot of fun to be around. And this is Mary. Mary was one of the very, very first mermaids at Weeki Wachee. She auditioned when she was about 15 years old. And the story she tells is that she went up to Weeki Wachee with her friends to go swimming because it was an undeveloped spring at that time. They went up to go swimming, and this fellow named Newt Perry was there, and he had roped it off and told her that they were going to sink a theater into the spring. And if she wanted to try out to be a mermaid, she could come back the next weekend. And that's what she did. And the test to become a mermaid was to swim across the spring and back. And if you didn't drown, you could be a mermaid. And that's what happened. That's how she became a mermaid. And this is one of the, probably the first, I guess it's the first theater. You can see the people looking out, and they were doing the fish feeding, which they always did it and still do at all the shows. So Mary's about 15 in this photograph here. And like I said, she's in her 90s now. And this is the guy, Newt Perry, who started the whole enterprise. He started at Silver Springs. The story of Weeki Wachee is really the story of 3 springs. It's the story of Silver Springs, because that's where he first moved when he came to Florida. And then he went to Wakulla, and then he ended up at Weeki Wachee. So I'm going to try to touch on all these little spaces that he was in, because he was developing his ideas the whole time. So this is him. He was a champion swimmer. So when he got to Silver Springs, because he was such a good swimmer, the manager at Silver Springs hired him to teach people how to swim. And Newt, he saw how clear the water was, and he decided to try to do things underwater that you would normally do on land and try to film those things. And that's how that whole thing got started, with filming people underwater, was through Newt Perry. And this photo was made at Silver Springs in the 1920s. And this is one of Perry's sisters at Silver Springs. So you can see he had the idea for Weeki Wachee very early in his life. The water was so clear. Newsreel companies flocked to Silver Springs once they knew Newt Perry was figuring how to do performances underwater, and they started filming a lot of newsreels down there. And most of you might know what newsreels are, but back in the day, at a movie theater, they would show a newsreel, which was like a short, documentary type film, prior to showing the feature of the day. And so a lot of these were made at Silver Springs. And this is a photo, I think one of Newt's wives, he had 2 or 3 wives. One of his wives and his sister is in that photo there. And that was made in 1928 at Silver Springs. So you can see the fish feeding even there at Silver Springs. And this here is a photograph of Newt Perry. And the guy, I don't know how your screen looks, but there's a guy, the lowest guy on the ground behind the turtle, that's Johnny Weissmuller. He became Tarzan. And Newt Perry, you can see the top of his head's kind of blonde. That's him. And this was actually part of a newsreel. It's a still from a newsreel. And they were catching turtles underwater for the newsreel. Okay. And that's Johnny Weissmuller. As I said, he became Tarzan later, and he and Newt Perry were really good friends. And there's a picture of Newt Perry with Johnny Weissmuller at Silver Springs. Most of the early Tarzan movies were filmed at Silver Springs. Silver Springs is in Ocala, for those of you that aren't aware of it, but it's Silver Springs is actually the oldest probably attraction, because it's a spring that's been there forever. And the steamboats used to come up there. So it's been there forever. But Newt Perry formed a real strong friendship with Johnny Weissmuller. And this is when he was developing his whole connection to the film industry, which would come in handy later when he moved up to Weeki Wachee. This is the kind of image Newt Perry, that's Newt Perry on the bicycle. This was underwater at Silver Springs. This was one of the postcards. This was probably part of a newsreel, and they had a whole scene staged underwater, a dancing scene in a bar, which I thought was pretty cool. And that's Newt Perry with probably one of his sisters underwater. Again, probably a still from a newsreel that was turned into a postcard. And this is another postcard from Silver Springs. Now, what I'm about to show you, if everything works right, is a film that was made at Silver Springs. This is one of the newsreels that was made at Silver Springs. And Newt Perry is in this film. You'll see him on the tightrope. So let's watch this. Hopefully everything's going to work.
A lovely stretch of water and woodland known as Silver Springs, Florida, is the most perfect setting for underwater photography in the whole of America. As you sail up its tree-bordered reaches, you're amazed at the crystal clearness of the water and the smoothness of the submerged limestone rocks. Today, we're lucky enough to drop in while preparations are being made for a show, an underwater circus. And most of the props you'd expect to find in an earthly circus are being got ready for the depth. Setting up the scenery on the bottom is rather a wet job, so the stagehands wear tin hats to keep the water out of their ears. While they're going down, they get air by the pumpful. Every bit of scenery has to be weighted to make it stay put, and even the hot dogs will be heavy on the chest. Underwater acting is just one damp thing after another. In a maze of stakes and guy ropes, the circus is taking shape. We know what to do if we feel hungry, but what happens if we feel dry? For our underwater pictures, we've brought our little submarine camera. It fits onto a platform inside a steel cylinder, made especially to resist water pressure and the advances of brazen mermaids. Just as the props are weighted, so must the performers be. The anklets are just heavy enough to do what their parents found extremely difficult, keep them under. Even the garlands have to be made of leaden flowers. Well, now we're all set and the camera's fixed, so let her go, George. Swim up, swim up, swim up for the greatest, slickest, grandest, loveliest, daintiest, and wettest circus in the world. Mussolowski, famous strongman, can raise anything except a couple of pounds in a hurry. Wonder if he's got any cigarette pictures. The hula hula, and her mother told her never to sit on wet grass. He's so strong he can break a promise with his little finger. And now for the most sensational, most stupendous, most ridiculous tight wire act in the universe, or thereabouts. Sit back and gasp at the amazing skill of these daredevil sprites. Did we say tight wire? That's not the only thing that's tight. Alley, up! La Belle Maggie Smith. She started by walking on air and then on thin ice. But now she's as used to a wire as a telegraph boy. You ever see such a saucy seesaw? They may take a lot of money, but they can't take a single breath. Gee, that's a good idea. These hot dogs are made from water spaniels. And they say the hot dog man sunk all his capital in floating his business. My.
Now, could y'all hear the sound on that? Could y'all hear the sound? Can you hear me?
Yeah, it's working fine.
The sound is working?
Yes, great.
I had this thing pop up and it's like, so professional audio. I'm like, oh my God, I hope it's working. Okay. So that was Newt Perry at, that was at Silver Springs. And again, you saw those divers going down with those hard hats on. you have to remember that scuba hadn't even been invented yet. And so they were going underwater with the hard hats, like the tarpon divers, the sponge divers used and divers used. And so at that time, Newt Perry was starting to get the idea about using the hose, to get air to the mermaids, which came later. But what I'm trying to get you to see is how he's forming these ideas. At every spring that he's at, he comes up with more and more ideas. Now, in this photograph, you have them mowing the eelgrass at Silver Springs, and the woman in the background is Ginger Stanley. And Ginger Stanley worked with Newt Perry at Silver Springs and at Weeki Wachee later. She became a mermaid, but she's famous for being in The Creature of the Black Lagoon, as a result of her connection to Newt Perry and all her underwater work. She was one of his favorite models. And a lot of these photos, too, are made by the famous Bruce Moser. Bruce Moser came to Ocala to take some pictures for a Tarzan film, and he developed an apparatus to get underwater with a camera. And so he's famous for making all these really cool underwater photos at Silver Springs. And here's another one, and you can see Bruce in the background with that kind of helicopter or airplane looking camera thing. And that's Ginger Stanley, who just really recently just passed away. So now in the 40s, Newt Perry had made such a name for himself at Silver Springs by involving himself with the film industry down there. Not only with the Tarzan movies, but like The Yearling, he scouted all the locations for that film. And so the guy that built a lodge up at Wakulla, Ed Ball, he heard about Newt Perry, and he wanted Newt Perry to come up and manage the Wakulla Springs Lodge and try to get more people to come there. And Ed Ball built that lodge in 1937, and that's near me. That's how I got connected to the whole Weeki Wachee thing, is through Wakulla. Because I read a history of Wakulla, and they talked about how Newt Perry came there, managed the spring there, and then went on from there to start Weeki Wachee. So he was at Wakulla too. And the very first thing Newt Perry did when he came to Tallahassee was to try to find some mermaids, some women to do performance in water. And FSU at the time, obviously, was the FSU, Florida State College for Women. And they had a synchronized swim troupe called the Tarpon Club. And so Newt Perry got the Tarpon Club to come down to Wakulla, and they would put on shows down there, some synchronized swimming shows for the newsreels. And this is a photo of them on the sign down there. This is a still, probably. They were, as you can see, there's a film camera at the bottom. They were probably making a newsreel for the Tarpon Club to perform in. This is another shot of the swimmers from the Tarpon Club. And there's Newt Perry with some of the swimmers from the Tarpon Club. I don't know if he's measuring them or what. It looks like he's putting weights on them or something. Now, this is a shot where you can see the filmmakers on the dock out there, and they're probably filming. They had a little short film called Campus Mermaids, and this was probably part of that. And so Newt Perry took advantage of the newsreel companies, because those were like free advertisements for Silver Springs and for Wakulla. And this is an apparatus. They actually called this thing a hole in the water, because cameras weren't watertight. So they had to figure out a way to film underwater. So Newt Perry worked with the filmmakers, and they designed this thing they called the hole in the water. And the filmmaker would get inside this thing, and it had a glass in the bottom of it, and they would film underwater scenes from that apparatus. And that's Newt Perry behind the filmmaker. And this is at Wakulla Springs. And this is Newt Perry fishing underwater. And while he was at Wakulla, they put these airlocks. And again, this is something he would later use at Weeki Wachee, the little airlock. And so he sank a few of these at Wakulla Springs. And he wasn't just using the Tarpon Club synchronized swimmers. He also went up to Leon High School and recruited some of the teenagers to come down. One of those teenagers was Nancy Tribble Benda, who became, she's on one of the brochures. In fact, she was on that brochure we saw earlier. And when Newt Perry opened Weeki Wachee, she went down and helped train mermaids, but she was a teenager when she met Newt Perry. And another teenager he met at Leon High School was Rico Browning. And Rico Browning, worked with Newt Perry and ended up, he was the underwater creature in The Creature from the Black Lagoon. He was famous for that. So Newt Perry had an influence on a lot of different people. And this is another image of Newt Perry underwater, probably with some of the teenagers that he was training to perform underwater. These are teenagers, probably from Leon High School. And you can see another airlock in the back. They ended up having to take those out because it was during the war too, and some soldiers came up there, and I think a soldier went into one of them and almost drowned coming out of it, and so they had to take them all out because they were a little dangerous for people that didn't know how to use them. Now this is Newt Perry standing on this glass house here, and you can see these swimmers are on a big. Do y'all see that big alligator? It's an alligator boat. And he had that made, and he built the glass house so that these performers could swim. They would swim underneath it and climb into it, and it would warm them up. If you've ever been in a Florida spring, they're cold. They stay about 72 degrees all year round. They stay the same temperature. And if you're in the water long enough, your body temperature starts dropping and you can get pretty cold. This was a postcard, but it was also a still from a little film they made down there. They had a little jalopy rolling into the spring, and the kids got out and had a picnic underwater, and that was pretty cool. And this picture actually made it into National Geographic. It was two girls putting on makeup underwater, and it was actually used in National Geographic back in the 40s. This is from a beauty contest they had down there. Newt Perry had an underwater beauty contest at Wakulla Springs. And I have a clip of that I'm going to show you in just a second. Here's the clip. Now, this was made at Wakulla Springs, and they went underwater and crowned the beauty queen.
Florida, in case you didn't know it, has long been famous for mermaids, and the latest news of them comes from a place called Wakulla Springs, where they recently held an underwater mermaid beauty contest. When the judges had made their decision, the mermaids insisted that the coronation itself must be held underwater, so one of the judges, rather ungallantly smoking a pipe, went down with Miss Mermaid to crown her as desired. How does he keep the pipe going underwater? Ah, well, you'd have to go to Florida to know the answer to that one. Margaret was
Okay, so he crowned them underwater, and I guess you're wondering how he could smoke underwater. Well, he figured out all the tricks, and one of the tricks was to take a cigarette or a pipe and put some milk in your mouth, and then when you're underwater, you put the milk in the water, and it looks like smoke. So he came up with all kind of ideas on how to do something you would do on land underwater. And they used to have he did this at Silver Springs. I think he did it at Wakulla, and he probably did it at Weeki Wachee. He would have Thanksgiving underwater. And Ginger Stanley told me they would have a turkey and everything. They would have the turkey underwater. They'd be sitting at the table, and they would be eating underwater. They would be drinking coffee, and it looked like coffee was poured out of a coffee pot, but it was BBs. He put a bunch of BBs in a pot, and from a distance, it looked like coffee. So he had came up with all these clever ideas to make things look just like they did on land. And of course, they weren't staying underwater the whole time. I actually saw the Thanksgiving dinner uncut version, And you could see the swimmers would eat a little bit and then they would swim to the surface and all you would see would be their legs. And then they would come back down and shoot again. And obviously they were editing all the tape. Now this elephant is part of a Tarzan movie. When New Perry went to Wakulla Springs, Tarzan, they followed him there. They loved him so much, and Johnny Weissmuller loved him so much, they decided to film at Wakulla. So I think they made at least three of them at Wakulla Springs, and it's because of New Perry that they came up there. And Johnny Weissmuller stayed in the lodge, and apparently in the mornings he would open the windows and scream his Tarzan yell and delight everybody. These are just some scenes from the making of the Tarzan film. And there's Rico Browning. Like I said, Rico was a teenager when he met Newt Perry. He was a teenager at Leon High School. And how he ended up becoming the creature was Newt Perry was out of town and he called Rico. Rico was in college at that point, and he said, the filmmakers are coming to town and they want to scout the location. Can you take them on the river? And so Rico said yes. And so he took the filmmakers out on the river and they asked him, would he mind swimming in the water so they could kind of see what it looked like. And Rico, if you've ever seen the creature from the Black Lagoon, he has a unique way of swimming. He does his arms a certain way. It's very beautiful. And so they wanted him to do all the underwater stunts. And so Ben Chapman was the above water creature, and Rico was the real star, I think. He was the underwater creature. So that's how he ended up doing that. And Rico Browning also, because of his connection to Newt Perry, he got into film and he managed Ivan Tor's studio, which created Gentle Ben and the Flipper. Rico Browning actually wrote Flipper, which became a TV show and a movie. So his connection to Newt Perry had far-reaching effects in his life. And there he is with Ginger Stanley. So Newt Perry has been at 2 different springs, and the whole time he's been thinking about wanting to have his own place. And so he had been thinking about it for years. And finally, this guy told him, he said, hey, there's a couple of springs on the west coast of Florida. One is called Chest of Whiskey, which is Chesapeake, and the other is Weekly Washing. He called it Weekly Washing, but that was Weeki Wachee. And so Newt Perry went down there with Rico Browning. They dove in and saw how beautiful it was and decided they would do put the theater there. But first they had to pull out stuff people had thrown in. People had thrown in cars, baby buggies, mattresses, all kind of crazy stuff had been dumped into the spring. So they had to get all that out. So he opened the spring. So basically they sank the theater into the spring, and they had their first show in 1947 in October. And this was a still from one of the films that Newt Perry made down there. And this was the first brochure. And my friend, I mentioned her earlier, Nancy Trumbull-Benda, she's on the bottom of this picture here. She's the girl on the bottom. And this was a very famous pose at the Weeki Wachee. They called it the Adagio pose. And one of the mermaids that Newt Perry found from St. Petersburg, she is part of the Aquabelle. She created that pose with another young girl. Her name is Mary Dwight McDonald. Diane McDonald. Sorry, Diane McDonald. And this is the inside of the theater at Weeki Wachee. The very first theater was pretty small. And that's Newt Perry on the left talking with some filmmakers. And again, you have to remember this was before scuba. So looking out into a spring like that was kind of like looking on the moon almost. People weren't used to that. It was a pretty big draw for people. And this is this young lady on the far left. That's Nancy, who actually lived down the street from me here in Tallahassee until she passed away. But they're taking some sodas into the water because they're going to drink these sodas later in the show. They would always drink sodas during the show. And if you look across, you can see the underwater theater, the very top of it. The rest of it is underneath the surface of the spring. And that's Nancy eating some grapes. They're famous now for eating bananas, but they ate everything. They ate watermelon, they ate spaghetti, they ate hot dogs, they ate a lot of different stuff, apples, grapes. Bananas were just easier. And this is one of the very first postcards. And this group of young ladies is actually called the Aqua Bells. And they were the group that Newt Perry found over in St. Petersburg. And they were synchronized swimmers, but he trained them how to perform underwater at Weeki Wachee. So they became mermaids too. And this again is one of the first postcards featuring 3 of the Aqua Bells. And this is an early photo from Diane McDonald's album. And you can see they had the guys too. And now the mermen don't get a lot of attention, but they did have young men out there swimming early on. And if you look in the background of this photograph, you can see an airlock there. That's one of the airlocks they could swim into when they were taking a break from performing. And there's my friend Nancy. I keep calling her Nancy. That's Diane White McDonald. She's still alive. She lives down in St. Petersburg. And this was 1947. And she was just playing around underwater and they snapped the photo of her. And this is a scene from inside the theater. And again, it got a lot of attention. People really couldn't believe that they were performing underwater. They had a hard time believing it was real because, first of all, the water was so clear. It was hard to realize it was really water unless the fish were there. So it was being a little confusing to people sometimes. And as you can see, she has the air hose in her hand. At this point, Newt had figured out the air hose situation, and what it was compressed air, and they would have to bite on the end of that hose to get air to breathe. They would take a breath of air, and then they would perform for a little bit, and then they would take another breath of air. So it took a lot of athleticism, I think, to be able to do that. You couldn't just be a random swimmer. You had to really be a very good swimmer to do this. Now, right after Weeki Wachee opened, literally like weeks after it opened, Newt Perry got a call from Hollywood, and the director wanted to know if Newt Perry knew a good place where they can make a mermaid movie. And so Newt Perry said, Weeki Wachee. So they came to Weeki Wachee and they filmed parts of Mr. Peabody and the Mermaid there. And so the whole film crew came down, and it was very exciting for all the young people that were swimming there. Very exciting. And this was the star of Mr. Peabody and the Mermaid. That's Ann Blythe in the middle. And on the right is my friend Diane McDonald. And they all got to meet her, and it was really exciting. And there's Newt Perry. He had to teach Ann Blythe how to swim underwater because she wasn't used to it. She didn't do the stunts. A couple other mermaids did the actual stunts underwater, but she did have to learn how to swim underwater. And this is a still from that film. I mean, not from the film, but from them making the film. And this is Ann Blythe in the Mermaid Tale. Now, if you look at early postcards from Weeki Wachee, you will see that they are not wearing tails. Okay, they're just swimming without tails. They didn't have the material to make tails yet. Lycra hadn't really been invented, any stretchy fabric, so there was no way they were going to be able to perform underwater in a tail at that point. So when Hollywood came to film Mr. Peabody and the Mermaid, they had Bud Westmore, who's a very famous costumer. He made a tail for the show, for the movie. And it was like a $15,000 tail at the time. And so they would have that tail, and at night they would take it off and well, okay, let me backtrack a minute, because what happened was when they started filming, this is kind of a funny story, all the fish left the spring. The fish just left. And so the filmmakers said, nobody's going to believe this is underwater because there's no fish. And so they had to go down the river and scoop up thousands of fish and bring them back. And in addition to that, they smeared that tail with fish roe, which were fish eggs, so that the fish would swim around that tail while she was in the water. It would attract the fish to her. And then at night, when they hung that tail out to dry, a couple of people told me the bears came out of the woods and attacked that tail. And I couldn't believe that, but I actually found a little newspaper clipping that verified it. It said, yes, when they hung the tail out to dry on sawhorses next to the woods, bears came out and tried to take it away. But that was just one of the funny details. Now, this is my friend Nancy Tribble, who was a teenager at Leon High School. But they had the premiere of Mr. Peabody and the Mermaid down in Tampa. And so for that premiere, Luke Perry took this tank over there, and Nancy would get in that tank and she would smoke cigarettes, which nobody would do now. She would eat bananas and kind of let people take pictures of her. And so there she is inside the tank. And she said it was really a lot of fun to do that. And this is her in between her being on display in the square out there. Newt would sit her in his car. And she told me that people would walk by and look in that car and see her sitting there with that big tail on. And it looked so real. They would ask Newt, have you tried to take her to a doctor to get that tail removed? You know, they thought it was real. And she thought that was pretty funny, but that was Nancy. And Nancy, because she was a double, she actually went out to Hollywood, and she was still in high school at the time. And this was a page out of her scrapbook. She kept a curl of the wig and the pins and some of the netting that they used to keep the wig on her head. It was kind of cute. And this is a scene. Oops, that was a scene. Let me get back. That's a scene from a second theater that they built, I think. And you can see the mermaid wearing a little tutu. They're still not wearing tails during shows yet. And you can also see the air hose in that picture. These are just some of the photographs. I want to show you some of the postcards. As you can see, some of them even have on face masks. There's the fish feeding they did. This was a photograph made by a very famous fashion photographer, Toni Frizzell. And she did this photo shoot at Wachee. It was one of the very first outdoor photo shoots, and it was made at Wachee. And it's kind of an iconic photograph that's been used on a lot of albums. And we actually used it on the second Wachee book. These are more photos. You can see how clear, you can see how crystal clear. It looks a lot different now. There's a lot of algae in the water. And there's my friend Nancy out there swimming and flying, as she said. And this is a mermaid eating an apple, just to show you how they ate different things. Bananas. And this was the youngest mermaid I came across. I did not come across this mermaid until I finished the book. And I was giving a talk down in Apalachicola, and this gentleman showed up with a photo album, and that was his mom, and she was 9 years old. And she went down to Weeki Wachee, and she was her friends were friends of the people that were managing it at the time. And the mermaids taught her how to breathe underwater. It was pretty remarkable because she was only 9 years old. She didn't actually perform in any shows, but she was the youngest person who did that. This was probably in the 50s, the mermaids. So they really grew pretty fast, becoming the world famous spring of the live mermaids. In the early days, they would have like 10 shows a day, and they had like 25 mermaids on staff. You know, it became pretty big. They had to go to mermaid school. I don't think it looked exactly like that, but this was just one of the photos they made as a promotion. Now this will give you this is a little film that'll give you a little background on some of the things they do at Weeki Wachee. So let's watch this.
Beauty in the deep, the fascinating beauty of the underwater world, where we explore the mystery of ancient fable. The fable of mermaids who live at Weeki Wachee. Two of the stars in this world's greatest underwater spectacle swim out to perform graceful acrobatic routines in the crystal clear water, set against the background of Florida's underwater Grand Canyon. Weeki Wachee is the largest single spring in Florida, pouring forth 168 million gallons of water daily, and always at a temperature of 74 degrees. In this magnificent setting, the world's most highly skilled underwater artists entertain daily in a performance of beauty and daring. Viewed from the new $1 million underwater theater in year-round air-conditioned comfort. The great conch shell at the canyon's rim is actually an airlock where mermaids await their cue, breathing air until they emerge to perform their excitingly beautiful routines. Thrills that have been enjoyed by millions of people. Underwater, body is weightless because of the greater density of water over air, and these two charmers demonstrate their skill by going up or down without apparent movement, simply by controlling the body's air content. Now, a pretty mermaid swims toward the theater to give us a closer look at one of the most unusual scenes ever filmed. It's snack time, and this proves that fish do not fear people. These friendly little fellows have learned that every hour during the day, at every performance, food will be served, and by such a charming hostess. Mermaids get appetites too. This is probably one of the most difficult feats of all the unique features at Weeki Wachee, actually eating underwater. Drinking underwater too? Of course, but you have to be real thirsty. Now, a daring mermaid attempts a deep dive to the bottom of the canyon. She breathes hard into the mask to equalize the pressure on her ears. She begins her dive, down into the depths, 117 feet below the surface, equal to the height of a 10-story building. Inhaling the life-giving air from the hose, and then forcing air into the mask to balance the increasing pressure on her ears. For every 33 feet she descends, the pressure on her body increases over 14 pounds per square inch. She fights the tremendous current surging up from the spring, over 116,000 gallons a minute. It's a battle every foot of the way. Now, at the bottom, wedged in the rocks to withstand the upthrust of the spring. Then, soaring up, riding the swift currents to the surface. Pausing in graceful underwater acrobatics, taking time to adjust gradually to the lessening pressure as she approaches the top. Floating in the luminous beauty of water and sky. One of the wondrous beauties of nature combined with skill and daring. Truly, beauty in the deep at Weeki Wachee on Florida's Sun Coast.
So that film had a lot of the things. If you go there, you still see them do. You have the fish feeding, you have the eating and the drinking, and how they drink. They revealed the secret to me. You blow into the bottle, so you blow into the bottle and you just kind of suck it down. It's very hard to do. I've never tried it because I'm too claustrophobic underwater and I'm afraid of drowning, so I'm not cut out for that. These mermaids have to be incredible athletes because they're underwater. They would be underwater performing for 45 minutes at a time. And so they were staying underwater the whole time. They're taking air off these air hoses. And it's very hard. And when they do the deep dive, I've been in the theater when a mermaid was underwater without an air hose for over 2 minutes, 2.5 minutes. One mermaid could hold her breath for 5 minutes. So they were remarkable athletes, not just pretty girls, you know, it took a lot. These are the mermaids. Ginger Stanley shared this photo with me. That's her on the left. They were cutting up, you know, having cigarettes and beer and stuff. They were just playing around there. But they did have mermaid cottages on the grounds when ABC bought it. ABC bought it in 1959, and that's when they had the $1 Million Theater, and they had the mermaid cottages, and they started making props at that point, and doing more elaborate shows, because when ABC bought it, all of a sudden they could put sound out, and so the mermaids could hear sound. That wasn't possible before. It was just an improvement in technology. And this was one of the airlocks. The castle, I mean, that conch shell that was in the film was actually over this particular airlock. So by the time ABC got it, they had a lot of mermaids on staff. And here you can see by this time they did have tail that they could perform in, and do photo shoots in at this point, because they had lycra, and fabrics that were stretchy. This is a view from inside the $1 Million Theater, and this is how the theater looks now. Maybe not as fantastic as that, but when they were redoing it, they discovered, well, in the 70s, a company bought it and put a bunch of like carpet over underneath the windows up there, and they hid all this beautiful tile work. And when the state took over Weeki Wachee, they discovered all that beautiful tile work under there. And you can see the clamshell roof. I'm pretty sure they've uncovered that, because that got covered up too in the 70s by some bad architect. But these are some of the mermaids. And then they turned Weeki Wachee, they actually incorporated it as a city at some point so they could get Weeki Wachee on the map. And you can see they broke the name up at that point. These are some mermaids from probably the 50s, 60s, probably 60s, with this mineral water that had been taken out of the spring. And they also, once ABC bought it, they hired a choreographer, and she was able to talk to the girls in the spring, because they had, like I said, they had speakers at that point. And so they were able to choreograph shows. And this is my friend Bonnie. And if you ever get lucky at Weeki Wachee, you can talk somebody into taking you into the back of the theater where the mermaids are, and they have this big hole that they climb down into, and they enter the spring through this big hole. There's a giant tube that goes out into the spring, and it takes a lot of nerve to drop down into that hole, into the darkness, and swim like 15 feet, 20 feet, 30 feet out into the spring. And it was pretty scary, because there would be catfish in there. Sometimes their hair would get stuck on the light fixture in there. So it's pretty daunting. So there's Bonnie climbing down into the hole to go into the spring. ABC didn't want them jumping off the roof. They wanted them to appear in there as if they were like living in there. And there's the big conch shell over the airlock. And there's my friend Bonnie. I paid a tribute to Bonnie because she worked with me we did a photo book, and Bonnie and I worked together on that. And so Bonnie was incredibly helpful to me. And here she is with one of the props that ABC made. And this is from Alice in Waterland, I think. This is one of the photo ops they did for probably Barber Week or something. They would do photo shoots for whatever week it was. If it was George Washington's birthday, they would do George Washington stuff. This was probably Camera Week or something. So they were constantly filling the newspaper with these kind of things. This was back when we had actual print newspapers, and they loved getting these pictures. They would put them in the newspaper, and it would be a free advertisement for Weeki Wachee. There's Bonnie playing baseball underwater. And you can see, if you go to Weeki Wachee, it looks very different now. You don't see the eelgrass like this. It's because of all the runoff that has gone into Florida Springs. It's created a lot of algae in the water. And that algae has killed off a lot of the grass that used to grow naturally. And it's also covered up a lot of the white sand that you would see in there. And this is a mermaid feeding some fish at a little cafe underwater. This was from Alice in Waterland. You can see all the fancy costumes they have. Very elaborate. And this is from another one. This was called Mermaids on the Moon. Bonnie actually wrote this show. And these twins are Holly and Dolly. They used to own a sports bar in Castleberry, Florida. That's where I interviewed them for the project. But they were the twins. And this was from another show. And if you look carefully at the picture, you can see they have their feet hooked under a little bar there so they don't float off. Because you have to remember they would be floating around, but they've got body control. They're able to kind of keep themselves in one spot. This was from Snow White. Eating and drinking. So I'm just throwing y'all some postcards to look at here. This is from the heyday. You can see all the different mermaids. So they had about 1,500 different women over the years performed at Weeki Wachee. Some of them may have only lasted a week or two. My friend Bonnie probably was the longest working mermaid. She worked there as a mermaid for like 15 years straight. And eventually what happens is you get too cold to stay in the water, and you also develop ear problems. One of the highlights at Weeki Wachee was when Elvis Presley came down. He was filming Follow That Dream at Crystal River. He came down and there was practically a stampede at Weeki Wachee. The Mermaids put on a special show for Elvis. They had the Elvis Presley Underwater Fan Club. He gave everybody record albums. It was a pretty big deal. There's Elvis meeting a mermaid. And by the time I came along to do the book, the mermaids had shrunk down. There were only like 6 or 7 mermaids performing. The mermaid Weeki Wachee was on the brink of closing. And over the period of time, there were several twists and turns in what happened. It almost closed. And then finally what happened is the state stepped in and bought it. And now it's a state park. So the mermaids are actually like park rangers now, that they perform. And this is a group of the former mermaids who I don't know if they're still performing or not. I was told that they may not be allowed to perform anymore, but they were performing for a very long time. And this was where the manatees would come up in the spring. So it's just showing you some of the, these were the days when I was down there. This is kind of how it was. This was a more recent picture from their website with the really super fancy tails and all that. They had really fancy tails. And there's Bonnie doing a little spring cleaning. I like to end with that one because the springs are, they're delicate ecosystems, and anytime we fertilize the ground and stuff, it goes into our aquifer, and the aquifer dumps into these springs. And so the runoff goes into the springs and it adds in fertilizer basically for all the algae and stuff. So anyway, so there's Weeki Wachee, and I'm trying to not overdo my thing here. I'm ready to take some questions if y'all are ready to ask them.
Thank you very much, Lou. Barbara, do you have a question, or Nora, would you like to go through the questions in chat?
Yeah, sure. One of the questions was, how did the performers never suffer from hypothermia? Swimming in the springs, we know it's very cold.
Well, they would approach hypothermia. When I was down there visiting and meeting the mermaids, one of the first things they did after a show was they got in the hot showers immediately, to warm up. They did 2 things. They got in hot showers and they ate because they burned up so much energy performing. But they didn't, I don't know if anyone that fell out from hypothermia, but that's what Bonnie said. She finally had to quit because she just had cold intolerance at some point. you have another one?
One of my questions was, when did the hoses come into play?
Well, he started those in the beginning when it opened in 47. He was developing those hoses when he was up at Wachee. I mean, up at Wakulla Springs.
Okay.
He got the idea from those hard hat divers, because they would have a hose attached to the headpiece. And so he just took the headpiece off and then put a little, almost like how you put air in your tires, that kind of thing. And they had a little thing on the end, they had to bite it. And when they bit it, it would release air, and they could inhale the air and hold the air and then perform for a little bit. So you had to be careful what you were doing.
Lou, I'm curious, the girls that were doing the underwater ballet kind of moves, they didn't seem to have weights on, right?
They didn't. That's what's remarkable. I know in the film it showed that they put some weights on their legs and stuff, but the mermaids, what they did is they equalized their body, like by blowing. They would release enough air so they could stay at one level. In the spring, they didn't need weights, and they actually do a little, routine where they do the human elevator, and so they'll take a suck of air off the hose and then they'll float up, and then they release the air and they float back down. They just learned how to maintain the air in their body so they stay at one level. It's pretty remarkable. If you think about that, it's hard to do.
Fabulous. I loved all the old movies. That's just fabulous.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy because, like I said, you couldn't just be a regular swimmer. And some girls actually did show up down there wanting to be mermaids, but they couldn't swim. They really wanted to be mermaids, but it's like, we can't swim. And it's like, well, you can't be a mermaid. You got to be able to swim.
Was Newt involved in the sale to the state of Florida, or was
No,
he gone?
he was long gone by then. He died in the 80s, and actually he was gone, but he left prior to even ABC buying it. He stayed there for 3 or 4 years, and then he went off and did a venture out in Texas. He did a Little Mermaid thing out there. And then, another person came in. It changed hands multiple times, so that gets a little too much to try to track, follow in a talk like this, but it changed hands multiple times. But he died I think in 87, I think.
And Virginia asks, what year did they start with the tails?
Well, they had the mermaid tail for the movie that was made like in 48 or something like that, but they didn't have the material to make tails until probably around the time ABC bought it, because they didn't have stretchy material. You couldn't put like cotton muslin or anything like that. You wouldn't be able to move, it'd be too risky. So it wasn't really until later, and they didn't always. And if you go to the shows now, you'll see they don't always wear the tails in the shows. A lot of times because when they started the shows in 47, they literally just did ballet moves. They were just doing ballet, and they called them mermaids, but they did not wear tails until much later, And it makes sense. They just hadn't invented the fabric yet that could handle something like that.
Do we have? Go ahead.
I was going to ask about her hair. I see Bonnie's hair, and it's not. How did she keep her hair in place instead of like?
That's a good question. It might have just been a trick right then, but I know that one of the mermaids that was in the underwater beauty contest told me they put like stuff in their hair to keep it down. It's possible that she put some kind of thing on it to keep it down, and I can't remember what they told me, but they put something in their hair to keep it. But most of the time, they loved it when their hair was floating around and stuff. Like I said, it might have just been the moment that her hair was happened to be still at that moment, But that's a really good question.
Virginia had a question, Nora. Did you see that?
Yeah, I'm not sure I understand what year the about the tails, what year the material came about for the tails.
Yeah, just in the late 50s, I'm guessing, you know. And they had the tails, what they told me, they had posing tails for photo shoots, and those tails, the zipper went up the back. And the swimming tails, the zipper was on the side. And the reason it was on the side was so if they got in trouble, they could unzip it and get out of it quicker, you know. And that was something I hadn't thought about, but they did have that. So they were, you know, when you're swimming with a tail, it's easier to drown. I'll just put it that way.
Is that all the questions, Nora?
That's all I see in the chat. Just one other is about if the recording will be distributed. And yeah, we have a YouTube channel. And I will put the link in the chat for that, and we'll get this video up as soon as we can for tonight's presentation, and all of last season's videos are available.
And please remind everyone to fill out the evaluation.
Survey.
Yeah, the evaluation link that's in the email invitation, I believe Ann said.
Yeah, one thing I forgot to mention, of course, was the effect Disney had. You know, even after ABC bought it in '59 and Disney came to Florida in the '70s, and that's what really ultimately killed Weeki Wachee was Disney World. You know, when Disney World started, they were like, it was a boom for Weeki Wachee because they only let certain number of people in per day, and then the overflow would go to Weeki Wachee, they would go to Silver Springs, they would go to Cypress Gardens. And so they went from like 10 shows a day to when I got down there, they were doing like 3 shows a day. That was it. And they only had like 5 mermaids on staff. And that was a direct result of Disney World. The thing about Weeki Wachee is it's a very human level entertainment. You know, it's flawed, you know, it's not perfect. There are actual women in the water doing this. Turtles can swim in, manatees, so it's a very human scale thing. And I was fascinated by it when I went the first time. You know, I would much rather do that than go to Disney World, you know.
Well, thank you very much, Lula. That was fabulous. I enjoyed it very, very much. Thank you.
Well, thank y'all. And if y'all think of any questions, you know how to email me, so you can email me a question. I'll be happy to answer it.
Fabulous collection of pictures and postcards.
Yeah. It's a lot. Like I said, I have to watch myself because I could go on, you know.
Thank you very much, Lou. Thank you, everyone, Barbara and Nora, for helping with tonight's programming.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank everybody for showing up. I appreciate it. I really appreciate you guys inviting me and everything, and it was fun to talk about. I miss my mermaids because, like I said, a lot of them are starting to die off. You know, it's like, oh my God, you know. It's awful, but I got to meet them, and that was a highlight, you know, of my life, really meeting all these mermaids.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, well, y'all take care, and thanks again for inviting me.
Okay, thank you.
Have a good night, everyone. Thank you for coming. We'll see you next month, Monday, November 27th is our next program. Good night, everyone.